Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations. I am Jim Lindsay, the Marion David Boys Distinguished Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy and Director of Fellowship Affairs here at the Council. It is my great pleasure and honor to open today's Hauser Symposium on the Axis of Autocracies. It is a timely topic. For the past decade, but particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we have witnessed growing bilateral cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. These countries are in some ways strange political bedfellows. China is a Marxist-Leninist state. Russia is a personalist dictatorship that positions itself as a defender of Orthodox Christianity. Iran is a militant Shia Islamic theocracy. North Korea is a family dynasty. But whatever their differences, those four countries appear to share a common goal of reducing U.S. global influence, which they see as a threat to their interests and an obstacle to their national ambitions. The challenge for U.S. foreign policy is to understand the nature of the cooperation among the members of what has been variously called the axis of autocracies, the axis of upheaval, and the quartet of chaos, to assess its sustainability and potential for expansion, and to determine how best to respond. To tackle these questions, we have organized 3 one-hour-long panels. The first session will look at the rise of the Axis. The second will look at the extent of the efforts by China, Russia, and North Korea to build support in the global South. And the third will examine the options the United States has for responding to the axis of autocracies and what risks and opportunities those choices pose. We will conclude the symposium at 4:45 p.m. Those of you who are here in New York are welcome to join us for an in-person reception. Before we begin our substantive discussion, I have several people I want to thank. First and foremost, I want to express my deep gratitude toward Rita Hauser. Rita's up here in the front table. Rita's generosity has made today's symposium possible. Rita is a longtime member of the Council. Her guidance and support have left an indelible mark here at CFR. And I just want to say, Rita, we are forever in your debt, so thank you. Rita established the Hauser Symposium nearly 2 decades ago. It was designed to enable the Council to focus each year on a major challenge or opportunity facing the United States. I'm proud to say this is the 17th iteration of the Hauser Symposium, and I've had the privilege to be involved with its planning over the past 15 years, and I can say it has been an absolute delight to work with Rita. I also want to thank the roughly 100 Council members and guests here at Peterson Hall at CFR's New York offices, as well as the more than 200 members and their guests joining us virtually. Your support makes all that we do possible. I also want to thank our incredible staff on our meetings, events, AV, and membership teams. They have worked hard over the past several months on making today's symposium possible. I especially want to thank Tegan Judd. She has been the driving force making all this come together. Is Tegan in the room? We can get Tegan to come out from behind the pillar. I'm not really sure why Tegan is behind a TV screen and a pillar, but Tegan has been instrumental in making all of this happen. And again, I also want to thank all of our distinguished speakers and presiders for joining us. The Council is very grateful to have them with us today, sharing their perspectives and expertise. Let me bring my introductory remarks back to where I started. The Council held its first Hauser Symposium back in 2006. That was a time of great optimism that the era of great power competition and rivalry had given way to a new era of cooperation and prosperity. 19 years later, we know that turned out not to be the case. Great power, competition, and rivalry have returned. That rivalry has the potential to undo the prosperity the world has enjoyed for more than 3 decades, and possibly even threaten the return of great power war and the unthinkable consequences that would bring. The challenge for U.S. policymakers is to fashion a foreign policy that avoids those two perils. Succeeding in that task requires correctly assessing trends in world affairs, neither exaggerating the threat nor underestimating it, and fashioning an appropriate response. The goal of today's Hauser Symposium is to contribute to that effort. For that reason, all 3 sessions of the Hauser Symposium today are on the record. Now, I'm going to break from the podium. I'm going to go sit down, and we will actually get into the substance of why we're here today. The title of this panel is, as you know, The Rise of the Axis of Autocracies. As I just mentioned, our focus over the next hour will be on the expanding ties among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and what that cooperation means for the United States as well as its friends, partners, and allies. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the 3 individuals who are going to help us do that exploration. And I'm going to go sort of from my left all the way down to the right. Immediately to my right is Jennifer Cavanaugh. She's a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities. Jennifer previously worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and directed RAND's Army Strategy Program. Jennifer's many publications include a piece she co-authored in Foreign Policy called The Axis of Evil is Overhyped. Axis of Evil is another name that's been offered for this collaboration. To Jennifer's right, physically, we're not talking about politically, is Thomas Graham. Tom is a distinguished fellow here at the Council. He was special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia on the staff of the National Security Council from 2004 to 2007, and director for Russian affairs on the National Security staff from 2002 to 2004. His many publications include the book, Getting Russia Right. At the extreme right, again, geographically, not politically, is Chris Chivvis. Chris is a senior fellow and director of the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has previously served as the U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Europe. He is the co-author of the Carnegie Endowment paper, Cooperation Between China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, Current and Political Future Threats to America. And he's also the author of the recent Foreign Affairs article, The Fragile Axis of Upheaval. So again, thank you, Jennifer, Tom, and Chris for joining me. Just to lay out what we're going to do, I'm going to engage my 3 co-panelists in a conversation for about 30 minutes. At that point, I want to bring the rest of the room, as well as people who are joining us through the wonders of the internet, into the conversation. So start getting your questions ready. I'm going to begin. I throw the first question, I guess, to Chris. I noted in my introductory remarks that cooperation has emerged between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It's gotten lots of names. I want to put aside the question for now, what the appropriate name is. What I'd like to do is really sort of focus on what kind of cooperation are we seeing between or among these countries. Chris?
So great. Thanks very much. This is a good place to start. I mean, a couple of points maybe off the top. It's obviously, the cooperation that we're seeing among these powers is extremely complex, and there are different forms to it. So it's difficult to summarize accurately, what we're actually seeing. But I think it's clear at least from my view, that while all four of these countries are adversaries of the United States, capable of harming U.S. national interests, countries that we ought to be concerned about, the extent of their cooperation does tend to be, or at least over the course of the last couple of years, has been exaggerated. This is not a recreation of the Warsaw Pact. It's not certainly not anything that even begins to resemble the alliances that the United States has profited from and enjoyed over the course of the last 75 years. What we really have here are a set of 6 bilateral relationships, which existed, have existed in various forms for decades, but which have really intensified as a consequence of Russia's war on Ukraine. A lot of the reason why we are here today having the conversation that we're having, the reason why the Council on Foreign Relations is holding an event on this subject is because Russia needed help with its war on Ukraine and reached out to Iran, North Korea, and China for that help. So I would say that to a large degree, this coalition, entente that we've seen, and which we should be concerned about, is rooted primarily in the war. And my expectation, therefore, is that if the war comes to an end, they're going to start running into some problems in their cooperation.
Okay, I want to get to that eventually, but I guess if we could just sort of lay out for people what exactly are these countries doing when they cooperate? Because again, a lot of the debate has been over what to call it, and again, I have a list here of 20 different names that have been offered. I guess the sweepstakes for naming rights. But I guess just briefly, maybe pick out one of the bilateral relationships, Chris, and sort of tell me what's actually happening.
Sure. Well, okay. So the key developments that have been of most concern to the United States and our allies are obviously Iran's provision of drones and missiles to Russia, North Korea's provision of troops and some types of weapons, and China's provision of dual-use technologies, all of which have allowed Russia to prosecute its war on Ukraine with a much more effectively than it would have without that support.
Okay. Jennifer, I wanted you to pick up on this, and I would like if you could talk a little bit about the significance, if it is significance, of the military exercises that have been carried out either bilaterally or jointly among some of these countries. I mean, Chris already alluded to the fact that North Koreans have provided the Russians with shells and people, so that's actual combat. But I know, for example, that the Chinese and Russians have conducted military exercises. They entered Alaska's air defense identification zone. I believe Russia, China, and Iran have conducted naval operations in the Gulf of Oman. Tell me a little bit about what's sort of happening in terms of these military exercises and to what extent they're significant.
Sure. So I think the first thing to note is that these countries have conducted military exercises together for some time. So this is not a new development in the past few years. Whereas our focus on this cooperation between these 4 countries is something that is new, partly because it has increased so much. And that's what I think people are reacting to. It's also the case, however, that these countries, their exercises are becoming longer, more complex, more involved, not just in what I would call like simultaneous play, where they're doing things alongside each other to where they're actually working together to do certain types of activities. One thing that I think is particularly notable is the trilateral naval exercises between Iran, China, and Russia, because it's one of the only examples where you actually break out of this bilateral pattern into something that looks a trilateral, which I think is notable, although not terribly alarming because it's been going on for 5 or 6 years. And these capabilities, especially for Russia and Iran, don't really rival the US Navy. But I also think it's important to put their growing cooperation on these exercises and entering the U.S. air defense zone or approaching U.S. shores in context of how much cooperation and exercises the United States does with its allies and partners, which is just on an order of magnitude higher. Much more complex, many more partners, huge, lasts for weeks. and also sometimes approach into areas that are very sensitive to China and Russia and Iran intentionally as a signaling exercise. So while this cooperation has increased and is something to keep an eye on, I don't think it's at the level right now where they could actually operate together in any type of real combat situation. It's more an exchanging of information and, again, signaling. They know this makes the US nervous, and that's why they're doing it. But to me, it's not something that's overly alarming because of the factors I mentioned. It's sort of still pretty small scale, and they really have no intention, as far as I can tell, of taking it to the next level and acting in a contingency situation, whereas the US exercises largely with partners that it plans to fight with. The goal is to prepare for wartime situations. So they are very different.
What is happening, Jennifer, on the technology cooperation front? I ask because there's been a lot of reporting that suggests that Russia, because it is at war with Ukraine and is running into very serious supply problems, has been willing to share military technology with North Korea, with Iran, with China, that my sense is previously members of the US intelligence community believed the Russians never would do. What do we know about what's happening on that part of the equation?
Yeah, and I do think that is the transfers out from Russia to Iran, North Korea, and China are some of the things that I do think are more concerning and are worth taking note of. When you're looking at transfers from Russia to Iran and Russia to North Korea, I think the most notable thing in terms of military technology is the transfer of fourth generation fighter jets, which are things that Iran and North Korea have wanted but didn't have. And so that is a step up. It's a significant upgrade from the fighter jets that they had previously. However, it's still well below the capabilities of the United States, as well as US allies and partners who operate fourth generation fighter jets that are more advanced, or fifth generation F-35s. And that's true whether you're talking about the Middle East or whether you're talking about Asia. So again, it's important to put the upgrade in context of it's not enough to really shift the balance of power, in my view. I think the transfers from Russia to China are in a different category, because there I do think that this is, to me, the most concerning set of transfers among all the different bilateral things, which is the transfer of engine technology. Aircraft engines are actually quite difficult to make, and China has really struggled to make their own. So they've been reliant on Russia and Ukraine, ironically, for aircraft engines for some time. And so the transfer of that technology will allow China to make better fighter jets that can rival US capabilities. And then there's the submarine quieting technology. And right now, China's submarines are much noisier than US submarines, which makes them much easier to track. And once they become quiet, like US submarines, like Russian submarines, they will be very difficult to track. They will be able to get into the open ocean, into the Pacific, and could potentially pose a threat to the US homeland, which is really, I think, what we should be most concerned about. So to me, those are troubling aspects, the transfers away from Russia, especially between Russia and China. The last thing I'll say on technology is the other place where they're cooperating that's worth keeping an eye on is the cyber capabilities, because they are cooperating in cyberspace and sharing techniques and tactics for overcoming various types of firewalls the US has. And that's another area of vulnerability for the United States. Even North Korea, which really can't challenge the US militarily, can challenge the US in cyberspace and cause significant harm, especially if they're getting help from Russia or other members of this group of four countries in terms of how to do it.
So, and just to be clear here, this technology, once given, the recipients get to keep. So the threat posed by it has a long shelf life.
Yeah, that's definitely true of the transfers from Russia to China. Russia has given fighter jets to Iran and North Korea. My understanding is that those countries are capable enough that they can reverse engineer. So now that they have the fighter jets, they can also replicate the technology. But there is that extra step.
Okay. Tom, I want to come to you and really ask you a two-part question. One is, to the extent you want to talk more about what your understanding is of what the Russians were giving to others, particularly on the ballistic missile and nuclear program side of things. But also tell us a little bit about what you see as Putin's calculations in taking these steps. Again, it's partly driven by circumstance, but as Chris pointed out, sort of the emerging bilateral cooperation among these countries predated February 2022. So sort of walk me through what you're seeing.
Well, I think Jennifer has covered quite well what we're seeing on the technology side. And I think she's absolutely right that what should be of most concern to us is the technology cooperation between Russia and China. And that is something that has been building for many, many years, accelerated by the conflict, but not new, and probably not qualitatively different from what it was before. The Russians were sending the best air defense systems to China before the massive invasion. They were setting their best fighter jets, and they also began to build an early warning system with the Chinese before the conflict. That's been ongoing, and I would argue, from the standpoint of American national interest, it's the China-Russia entente that is of most concern. Just by way of digression, I would have argued this should have been of concern to the United States a decade ago,
Okay.
but it actually took the conflict for the United States to begin to focus on this as a serious concern. From Putin's standpoint, a couple of things are worth underlining. First, you don't hear any talk about an axis of evil when you're sitting in Moscow, or even of this as some sort of coalition that Russia has put together for whatever purposes. I mean, it is circumstantial. They are looking for the Iranians, the North Koreans, for direct assistance in the military operation. The Chinese provide the type of assistance that is needed to keep their war production underway. But from Putin's standpoint, he's much more interested in a broader coalition. The BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, are really things that the Russians and Putin talk about much more actively, much more energy, put more effort into, because they see that as a real alternative to this US-led liberal international order. And so they focus on how these are expanding, the number of countries that are asking to join and so forth. And they talk very little bit about this quartet as being anything significant for the foundations of their foreign policy going forward.
So help me understand it then. To what extent is the emergence of this cooperation, in your view, Tom, driven by a sort of dislike for U.S. supremacy and a desire to cut the United States down to size? And how much of it is it, in your view, a function of U.S. policy? Because sort of the flip side, which is that the United States has issues with each of these four countries. We have essentially layered all kinds of sanctions, tariffs, export control in four countries. So to what extent is this collaboration a function of basically the United States pushing countries together?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is a function of the United States pushing countries together, particularly when you come to the sanctions regime. Right. So they have a lot to exchange in how you evade sanctions, and a lot they can do in helping. My understanding is that the Iranians provided a great deal of advice on how you circumvent oil sanctions, in particular from the United States.
Particularly get ghost fleets, as I
the United
understand
States. But part of this is a broader effort by, in Putin's mind, to undermine what he sees as a U.S. global hegemony, to create space for Russia to assume its rightful role on the international stage. The other thing I think is worth considering, and I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail, is there's actually a lot of tension in this relationship as well. None of the countries are totally comfortable with where the other country is. If you look at Russia's relationship with North Koreans, getting not only ammunition but soldiers, not something that necessarily went down quite well in Beijing, where they thought that they were the primary.
Lips and teeth are how the Chinese talk about their relationship with North Korea.
And the other thing is where we are now in the U.S.-Russian relationship.
Right.
And some suspicion in Beijing as to what Putin is really up to, how far is this going. So one of the interesting things that I hear from my Russian contacts is they're quite pleased that every time they deal with the Chinese, the first question is, well, how far is this relationship going to go with the United States? Are you still going to be as close to us going forward? And in a strange way, I'll just throw out a wild idea at this point. We talk a lot in the United States when we look at the Trump administration about this reverse Nixon or reverse Kissinger. Well, we're going to,
You may want to explain to people who aren't familiar with reverse
Yeah,
Kissinger
right,
what
exactly.
the reverse. It is not a dance move. It is not an ice skating move either.
Well, again, I think there's some people in the audience who actually remember all of this. But this was the Nixon effort to restore relations with China and to use that relationship to China to balance the relationship with the Soviet Union in order to draw strategic benefit from the relationship with both of those capitals. And so the idea is that at least some speculation that somewhere in the Trump administration, people are thinking about building a much closer relationship with Russia that would then pull it away from China and give us some strategic advantages in dealing with the Chinese. I think there's an interesting argument to make that Putin wants to be Kissinger, and that he hopes that the relationship with the United States develops to the extent that he becomes less reliant on the Chinese, that he plays that balancing role. And people in Beijing, to a certain extent, are worried about that, and the Russians are quite happy to get a sense of that nervousness on the part of the Chinese.
Okay. Well, let's pick up this question about the sustainability of this alignment. Chris, I'll go to you. I'll note that Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell last September talked about the emerging cooperation among these four countries as reflecting not a tactical alliance, but a fundamental alignment. You talk about it as a loose entente. So what is it that Kurt got wrong?
Well, I don't want to be too overt in my criticism of Kurt Campbell, but look, I mean, if you take my interpretation of this, which is that the cooperation has greatly intensified as a consequence of Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that there is obviously a history here, as there is a history to all things. If you look at other coalitions that formed during wartime, just from a historical perspective, it is very common for coalitions to fall apart once a war is over. And, putative allies or partners discover again the things that divided them in the past. This is a recurring theme throughout history. In fact, many believe that NATO would fall apart after the end of the Cold War. The reason why NATO did not fall apart, I think most people would conclude, is because it's highly institutionalized. We haven't seen any of that institutionalization, at least not anything that in any universe resembles the kind of institutional relationships that exist within NATO. We haven't seen that in this coalition. And so as a consequence, the kind of conflicts of interest that Tom was just referring to, and there are other ones as well. I mean, you didn't mention Central Asia, for example, which is a longstanding conflict or area of conflict between Russia and China. You did mention North Korea. Obviously, this is a conflict between Russia and China as well. And there's also the fact that, at least in my view, China doesn't want to be the head of this coalition of misfits. China has higher aspirations than that. They want to be like the United States on the world stage. They want to even potentially surpass the United States at some point. And so there are things that there are underlying conflicts here that I imagine, if the war ends, will probably come to the surface and make their ability to cooperate with one another much more difficult. Of course, to some extent, it depends upon exactly what you were talking about, which is what does U.S. policy look like? And I was thinking, as you said, that many in Washington are scratching their heads as much as the people in Beijing that you're talking about in terms of what it is that the current administration plans with Russia. But it is true that what the United States does with Russia and with Beijing will have an impact on the amount of cooperation that these countries are able to achieve.
Let me draw out a little more on this, Chris, because there is a big gulf between full-fledged NATO, Warsaw Pact style cooperation or alliance and being totally disconnected. There's a lot of room that falls in between. And I wonder about your diagnosis that should the war in Ukraine come to an end, that there'll be a significant decrease in cooperation for the following reason. One, as you note, the cooperation was beginning even before 2022, and Tom would date it back at least a decade or longer. But beyond that, there seems, at least for China and for Russia, North Korea, Iran, a common dislike of American power in the world. That's not going to go away once the war in Ukraine comes to an end. So couldn't we have something that sort of continues? It may be a marriage of convenience. I take your point that there are lots of things these countries can squabble over, but marriages of convenience can last quite a long time.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you asked.
I'm
because-
not speaking from personal experience. I just want to be clear.
No, I'm glad you asked, Jim, because my argument is not that there's no chance that their cooperation won't deepen. I'm just saying that it's not predetermined, and we shouldn't be making linear projections based upon the intensification that we've seen as a consequence of Ukraine. And I actually think that the United States has some agency here. I think our own policies do affect the extent to which these nations have been trying to cooperate with each other. So, if we pursue the right policies, I think we can reduce the prospects that this cooperation happens over time.
Jennifer, I want to give you a chance to take a crack at this question of how sustainable this relationship is. And maybe I'll add sort of a question to it, which is, do you see any potential for it to gain members? I mean, I've often heard talk about how maybe Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela would be interested. We've already heard discussion about Vladimir Putin's desire to turn the BRICS into a counterweight against American dominance of the global system. Any chance here that this alignment could surprise us and grow?
Well, so one of my problems with the Axis framing is that I'm not sure why we're focused on these four countries, like why those are the four countries, that's where the boundary falls, because it certainly seems to me that there are potentially troublesome military technology transfers happening in other places. We know, Venezuela has been close to Russia. There's Belarus. So, I struggle with the concept because I'm not sure why these four countries. The answer has been given to me when I've asked is, well, these countries are revisionist. They want to change the global order. But to me, it seems like Venezuela and Belarus and Cuba also are revisionist. They just don't have as much power. So I think it's possible that the alignment actually does endure beyond, at least for a while, at the end of the Ukraine war, primarily because I don't see Russia's military needs going away immediately upon a ceasefire or even like an enduring peace. Like, they need to rebuild their military. They've lost like at least one army's worth of people and equipment. So, like, to me, the desire to build up those military capabilities again is going to drive continued cooperation, at least for some time. I mean, that may attenuate. And I agree with Chris that certainly when the urgency and pressure of the war could allow some of the fissures in places like the Middle East and around North Korea and in Central Asia to potentially bubble up to the top. But it's also possible that the cooperation just takes new forms, and maybe it doesn't deepen, but it stays concerning and changes into different formats, trading different types of things. I mean, sanctions aren't going to go away overnight. So I see this as having potentially a long tail. I do think there is one kind of institutional check on the depth of their cooperation, which is that none of these countries, in my assessment, are willing to carry. They're willing to cooperate as long as it's win-win, but they're not willing to carry the burdens of another country. They're not willing to give more than they're going to get back. And one of the reasons why the NATO and the US-led order has endured so long is because the United States was willing to pay that role. They were willing to carry the burdens of other countries because they felt that the gains that they got in terms of being able to set the rules were worth it. But I don't see China playing that role. I don't see Russia having any interest in playing that role. And you see that playing out in the Red Sea right now, where it's the United States who's trying to reopen the sea lanes, whether or not you agree with that action, where China and Russia just paid their own way. They solved the problem for themselves, but nobody else. And so I see that as a check, because I see that as limiting how far any one of these countries will lean into the relationship. And so it's it will never be able to reach the level of cooperation that we see among NATO countries, because you don't have that like underwriter that the role the U.S. has played in its alliances.
Well, let me draw you out on that, really sort of in two respects, Jennifer. One, the issue of the long tail, that this could in fact be around and be a challenge for years to come. But also, as you sort of think about this challenge, the reality is that U.S. policy sort of can play a role and shape which way it goes. So I'm left wondering, at the end, looking at what you see and where you think trends might go, how do you judge this as a threat? How serious is it? How should we think about it?
Well, to me, the way to answer that question is to really think about like where U.S. interests lie. A lot of the cooperation that's happening in terms of transfers to Russia are aimed at aiding Russia in fighting in Ukraine. So how threatened you think that is really determined by how many interests you think the U.S. has at stake in Ukraine. At this point, I would say that the U.S. strategic interests have been met. Russia was kept from taking over all of the country. It's paid dearly for the gains that it did get, and that the best solution here is really to push for a peace, or at least push to get the U.S. out. I don't see the U.S. having enduring interests in the future security of Ukraine. I know there are many people in D.C. and probably on this panel who disagree with me, but so to me that cooperation isn't all that threatening. It's more, but it's not threatening. So one way to think about U.S. policy towards these countries is to think about what we can do to break them up. Another is to think about where our interests actually lie and where they're under threat, which is why I focused in on the submarine technologies, because that does pose a threat to the homeland. The U.S. definitely has strategic interests in Asia, but it might not be dominating the region. So maybe there's some transfers that aren't as concerning. We're really focusing on the homeland. So in terms of thinking about like U.S., like my focus would be on stabilizing relations with Russia and China so that these things seem less threatening or pose less of a threat, and making our interests resilient to whatever cooperation they do so that we're not so affected by every transfer they make. And that would mean investing in things like our own cyber capabilities and missile defense, and thinking about how we invest more in our own hemisphere, make sure our interests and on our borders are secure. To me, that's a better approach than trying to control what these other countries are doing.
Tom, let me ask you the same question about how you judge the seriousness of this threat. And I want to ask the question against the backdrop of an observation Hal Brands has made about how this alignment creates a distraction dividend. And again, taking Jennifer's point that they're looking for win-win, not we're going to take a blow for you, but that there is the opportunity that if one member is making trouble for the United States, the other can use that as an opportunity to create either additional trouble for the United States, or there's space created where they can go off and do something because Washington is concentrated on what one member of that alignment is doing. So how do you think about that?
An interesting idea. I'm not sure how that works out in the real world. Certainly, I think China benefits from the distraction that Russia is causing at the moment. If we get past the Ukraine conflict, I think you begin to see much more the tensions in these relationships emerging. Particularly if we get past sanctions with Russia. Russia has a much broader set of geopolitical interests than simply Iran, China, and North Korea. And in fact, they are pushed together by the fact that there are very rigorous sanctions regimes, particularly North Korea and Iran. But Russia's interests in the Middle East don't overlap entirely with Iran's. Russia's interests in Africa are in some ways competitive with those of China. We've already talked about possibilities in Central Asia. I think that what we begin to see are the tensions arising. Russia, we haven't talked about India yet. India becomes is still an important partner for China, and there's some military technology transfers going on in that relationship as well. So I see a much more complicated geopolitical situation opening up. Russia does think in terms of a multipolar world, as do the Chinese, as do the Indians, but they don't see it. But they also see it as a world of great power competition. And
their vision of what that multipolar world will look like and who the winners and losers are don't overlap.
No, well,
or don't align necessarily.
they don't align, and China to some extent, and you hear this more and more in Russia in the private conversations. China is actually a challenge for Russia over the long term. They have been historically, but given this asymmetry in power at this point in this emerging gap, if you're sitting in Moscow, the question you're asking is how are I going to counterbalance against China in the future? India provides some margin in the present time, but the sort of difficult reality for Putin is the only real counterbalance is actually the United States.
Okay.
And so I see this becoming a much more competitive relationship. I don't see this axis, if that's what we want to call it, really surviving as a geopolitical entity once we get past the Ukraine conflict.
But you don't think that Putin is going to give up on his vision of decentering the United States in world affairs?
Sure, but look, I mean, he doesn't want the United States to disappear. He wants the United States to remain a pole. From the longest time, and the Russian position, this actually goes back to the 1990s as well. The argument they would make is they want the United States to act like a normal great power, right? Which means you have to take into account what other great powers think and factor that into the way you behave on the global stage. They don't want a global hegemon, but they want the United States to be one among several great powers. And the only condition that is absolute for them is we be one of those great powers. So we're prepared to sit down with you, the Chinese, the Indians, whoever else appears, but as long as we're at the table, that's fine. We just don't want the United States to be the only person at the table.
And Russia is a great power that belongs to the table because it has nuclear weapons. What else?
Russia is a great power that belongs at the table because that is a fundamental core aspect of Russian national identity.
But it's not based on the Russian economy or...
The interesting thing about it is it not based on what we would call an objective assessment of power capabilities. It's in the psychology, it's in the mindset, and it comes from, historically grounded in the large role that they have played, but these vast resources, nuclear weapons are a part of it today, obviously. But Russia has never thought of itself as anything less than a great power over the past 3 centuries. And if you look at their actual power, that has ebbed and grown over the past 300 years. They are actually at a low point in terms of actual power at this point. But no one in the Kremlin is going to tell you we're not a great power.
So, Chris, how do you think about sort of the level of seriousness? Is this a 10, 5-alarm fire? Is this a nothing burger, a 1 or a 2?
You mean the
How do you
coalition
look
as a whole?
Yeah, I'll use a loose entente.
Yeah,
borrow
I mean,
your phrase.
I think it's important to distinguish between where we are right now and where we could be in 5 or 10 years. And this gets to your question about Hal Brands' point on cooperation. Maybe I can comment on that. But I mean, I think we're sort of at a 3 or a 4, but we could end up at an 8 or a 9 if we're not careful. So it's something that's important that we monitor. And again, the United States has agency in here. I mean, whether the policies that we adopt will have an impact on whether or not we see intensifying cooperation between these powers. What we don't want to do is to create a self-fulfilling prophecy where we assume that they are much stronger and more coordinated than they actually are. We take actions in our own strategy that reinforce that cooperation, and we end up in a situation which is bad for American interests. And one of the ways in which it could be very bad for American interests is actually this. What did you say? How called it?
A distraction.
Okay, I haven't heard that term before, but I think if I understand correctly, I agree with Hal about this one. I call it opportunistic coordination, which is that as time progresses and the relationships that we see right now, which again are only nascent, begin to develop and deepen, you could have a situation in which one of these, adversaries of the United States does something aggressive militarily, creates a crisis for the United States, and in that situation, another one of them, or potentially all 3 of them, take advantage of the situation in order to stretch the American military to stretch our political resources, to stretch our diplomatic resources in ways that would be extremely difficult for us to handle. And that's what we want to be avoiding.
At this time, I would like to invite members and guests here in New York and those who are joining us on Zoom to offer up their own questions for our speakers. I'm required to do this. As a reminder, this hybrid meeting is being recorded and is on the record. And if anyone wants to ask a question, just raise a hand. We're going to go back. I believe that is Scott Moore in the back. You can stand up, Scott, identify yourself, and ask a question. We'd appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks so much. Scott Moore, University of Pennsylvania. Following from that, I think what was a really interesting last kind of sequence of comments on the panel, I'd be curious on views of the Arctic, a region that we haven't kind of covered yet, but certainly very much in the news as a particular kind of wedge or pain point for China-Russia relations.
Who wants to talk about the Arctic? I can give it a start, and then because I'm an Arctic skeptic, actually, in terms of I'm not talking about climate change here, but I'm talking about in terms of the significance that it has for the United States. Obviously, it's significant. We're a global power. It matters, but in my estimation, it matters far more to China. And so the question that I have about Russian-Chinese cooperation to try to open up the Arctic route is, if one of the consequences of Russian and Chinese cooperation is that China is alienated from European markets, okay, which is something that could happen. Certainly, China has become a lot less popular in Europe on account of its support to Russia. If that happens, how valuable is that Arctic route to China in the end anyway? Because one of the main reasons, at least as I have understood it, that China is interested in opening that Arctic route is so that it can ship goods from China to Europe.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the Arctic? Tom?
Yeah, I mean, but this gets back to the idea of distractions that we've just talked about. Russia has distracted the United States and Europe. That actually, in a way, is not all that advantageous to China. If you're focused only on Taiwan, maybe. But the European market, that was of tremendous interest to the Chinese. And in fact, Russia has eroded China's own ability to access that market, which makes the cooperation in the Arctic less valuable. Unless you can use that Northern Sea route to get to Europe, there's no point in opening up the Northern Sea route. Again, I think this relationship is much more complicated. There's a lot more tension. And there's a tendency, I think, here in the United States to sort of simplify it, because we feel much more comfortable if we've got a bipolar, another pole out there around which we can rally ourselves, a real axis of evil. We feel comfortable in a world like that. Dealing with a genuinely multipolar world is something that, one, we've had very little experience with historically, and two, we don't feel quite comfortable because things become gray, and we really don't like gray when it comes to
Jennifer, you want to
international
join?
relations.
I also am an Arctic skeptic, but I do want to build off this last point, which is, I think one of the reasons why there was so much focus on this axis, especially under the Biden administration, was because it fit very well with their view of the world, which was democracy versus autocracies. And so it was a perfect sort of fit there. They wanted to tie the threats together. Their argument was we couldn't prioritize. We couldn't back away from Ukraine or Europe because it would send the wrong signal to China, whereas other people were arguing for prioritization. I think you've seen, even just in the past 2 months, like a attenuation of the focus, at least with the terminology of this axis of autocracies coming from the new administration, because it doesn't fit with their worldview. So while traditionally the United States has been very uncomfortable with a world that is more multipolar, I'm not sure that's true of the current administration, that is seeing the world in very transactional terms and is willing to cut deals in a way that previous administrations haven't, and maybe actually quite comfortable in a multipolar world. Now, that doesn't mean that all the steps that they've made and all the deals that they may broker are like the right choice for U.S. interests, but it does suggest that some of the ways in which the current administration is deviating from the status quo may actually be well suited to a multipolar world. And we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that a different approach to foreign policy in a world where power is more distributed actually could advance U.S. interests.
All three of you seem to be talking about an element of fluidity in global relations that some of the relations we see today could shift depending on what happens. What I would also note is the relationship that Europe has with the United States and with other powers could also change. I mean, if the Trump administration continues with this purely transactional approach to Europe, I could imagine people in Europe deciding that maybe they should reconsider what it is that they are doing toward China. And the Chinese may decide that they want to reconsider what they're doing toward
Right, and exactly,
Russia.
and that is one of the sort of critical
Mhm.
questions of the current moment
Mhm.
is whether Europe will finally emerge as a genuine geopolitical actor in its own right,
Mhm.
that is somewhat separate from the United States, and how that will change the geopolitical setting and what the implications are for the United States. Um, there are pluses and minuses
Right.
to this, depending on how we see our own interests. Uh,
But you're all
uh,
describing essentially what could be an inflection point
right,
in global
absolutely.
politics. All the way to the back, sir.
Hi, Philip Ellison, a guest here today. This maybe is a question for Jennifer. Given that at the time of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they were spending something like 3.5% of their GDP on defense. Now, after the invasion, it's something like 6%. It's a relatively small portion of their national wealth compared to what we spend, for example. It makes me wonder about these bilateral and trilateral alliances, how important they are, but also about the motivation for Russia to transfer technology to China, which, as we did in under the WTO, we're actually just creating competitors for our own industries. So I just wonder what motivated them to do that, or motivates them today.
Well, this gets to the question of how Putin views his goals in Ukraine, and at this point for Putin, I think that the outcome of the war in Ukraine is legacy defining. He can't suffer a defeat, and that has been that way for some time. He's doubled down on his support to Ukraine numerous times, and sacrificed interests elsewhere, including their arms trade, which used to be a major uh, role that Russia played in the world. It was like the #2 arms exporter. Like that's gone. It's lost a lot of its sway in Africa and in the Middle East. Potentially at risk are its bases in Syria. So it has lost a lot. So at this point, I don't think, I do think that Putin sees this as for not existential in the sense that the outcome will end. If that a loss would end Russia, but it's sort of existential in the sense that it defines his legacy. And so in that sense, I think the costs that he's willing to pay are clearly very high. And given the amount that their strategy is one of attrition. So they need as much stuff that explodes as possible. And they can't produce enough. They can't produce enough to keep up with that. So that's why they need the munitions from North Korea. That's why they need the cheap drones from Iran. They're not good drones, but they explode. And that's basically all you need. And from China, it's the dual use goods are crucial because they need those electronics that they're not getting from the West, or they need a route for that. So these have been really fundamental to allowing Russia to continue its war in Ukraine, which is why I think they've been willing to pay these additional costs, with the side benefit that these transfers are, even if they do create potential competitors for Russia, cause the United States significantly more angst than they cause Putin. And so the side benefit is sort of poking the United States and the rest of the collective West in the eye.
Could I
Tom,
just add?
I actually want to ask a question on this because the question reminds me that the Russian and Chinese economies in some way are complementary. China produces stuff. Russia produces energy that China needs. But I've heard that China has not been as eager as many Russians had hoped to build new pipelines. And I would note that there's a question of whether energy integration between Russia and China is good for either one because it creates a vulnerability.
Look, I mean, the Chinese hold the upper hand in this, and that's part of the problem that Russia faces.
Right.
And this is true of all sort of geopolitical, commercial, and economic deals. The Russians need to sell their oil and gas to China, and now in part because of Western sanctions, in part because they, on their own, collapsed their market in in Europe. The Chinese would love to have discounted Russian oil and gas, and all the deals, commercial energy deals, they are working on with the Russians. The sticking point usually is the price, and the Russian and the Chinese want something low. The Chinese have alternatives. We've been talking about this axis of evil. One of the competitors when it comes to oil is Iran. And so the Chinese are more than happy to play the Iranians off against the Russians to get a good deal.
So Moscow wants the United States to keep sanctions on Iranian oil.
Yeah, well, exactly, and lift them on Russian oil. But if you get to the technology transfers, again, the Russians need Chinese support more than the Chinese need to support the Russians. And so they're good businessmen. They are extracting as high a price as they possibly can. That gets them the submarine technology. It gets them the jet propulsion. It gets them an early warning system. What's not to like about that if you're in Beijing? So this conflict, from Chinese standpoint, actually helps them develop the types of capabilities they will need to compete against the United States over the long run, and by the way, to compete against the Russians over the long run. The Russians are short-term thinking. They want to survive the short term, and so they will provide this technology, even though it works against their long-term interests.
Did you want to jump in here,
I
Chris?
was just going to say, I mean, what Tom is saying and a couple of the things that Jennifer said point to a big point here, which is that China is so central to this coalition. Without China, this is not something we would be talking about.
I believe we have a question coming from our Zoom audience.
We'll take the next question from Stephen Flanagan.
Great. Thank you all very much. I had a question, Tom, particularly, I think for Tom, you raised the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it strikes me that in looking at the long-term relationship, particularly between Russia and China, developments in Central Asia, in areas where they have obvious elements of cooperation, but also intense competition, are going to continue. And seems as if that they even formed the Shanghai group in 2001 as a part to manage that. And certainly the Russians wanted to keep an eye on what the Chinese were up to in Central Asia. But there's obviously been this effort to also expand it to include, in now recently, Iran. And I wondered what you see as in that area of sort of Russia-China cooperation beginning to become strained in Central Asia, but extending even into areas of the Middle East. Particularly once their cooperation on the war in Ukraine is over. So thank you.
Right. I mean, the two countries have managed to their competition in Central Asia, I think, quite well up to this point. The Chinese extract commercial advantages. The Russians provide security. What's not to like about that if you're sitting in Beijing? I think there is potential competition in the Middle East, given that China is consumer of energy, Russia is an exporter of energy. Iran is interesting to the Chinese with the resources it can provide in competition with the Russians. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization theoretically provides a forum in which you can work out some of those differences, and perhaps decrease the intention that would arise otherwise. That's one. Two, I think from the standpoint of Moscow, part of what it's trying to do with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is embed China in a web of relationships that in some way constrain what the Chinese can do on the global stage in areas that are important to Russia. So it is an effort to create a hedge against China in Eurasia. The argument I would make is that is not going to be satisfactory from Russia's standpoint over the long run, given, I think, Chinese capabilities and Chinese ambitions. If you're sitting in Moscow, what you come up against is, again, it's the United States that provides you the only reliable hedge, and you've got to figure out a way to normalize relations with the United States. I don't think Putin is the guy who's going to do it, but I know that there are a lot of younger Russians that are of that opinion, and are more likely to influence policy in a serious way 10 to 15 years from now than they are in the immediate future.
Alexandra.
Alexandra Starr with International Crisis Group. I was wondering if you could talk about the potential consequences of the approach President Trump has been taking to ending the war in Ukraine, both for the United States and how it might be perceived by our European allies.
Who would like to take that question first?
I mean, I'll take that question first. I think one, that the Trump administration is right in wanting to try to bring this conflict to an end. I think where the administration has gone off track is to trying to position itself as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, as if we don't have a preferred side in this conflict. I do believe that that the U.S.-Russia channel is critical to resolving this conflict. But I would much prefer the United States to position itself as a leader of the West in that conversation with Moscow, as opposed to, as I said, a mediator. The leverage that we have with Russia comes from unity with the West, a demonstration that we can and are prepared to support Ukraine sufficiently so that Russia cannot win on the battlefield at any respectable cost. It also, by developing European military capabilities and an ability to act independently of the United States from time to time, also poses a serious challenge to the Russians going forward. And that would get give you some leverage in the negotiation. And finally, and perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, broadening the relationship with Russia to include things like talks about strategic stability and the Middle East also buys us some leverage with the Russians, because the relationship with the United States is psychologically extremely important for Putin. We already talked about Russia thinking of itself as a great power, but the second part of that is that Russia wants to be recognized as a great power, respected by a great power. And the only country that really provides that validation is the United States. So Putin has an interest in maintaining this relationship. If we understand that, we can use that, I think, effectively to get Putin to back off his maximal demands on Ukraine, to come towards a resolution that is more in line with what I would argue our long-term U.S. national interest, would also be satisfactory from the standpoint of our European partners, and probably the best that Ukraine could hope for in the current circumstances, which leaves open the opportunity for a future prosperous democratic Ukraine that's integrated into Europe. So leader of the West, not mediator. If you just change that, I feel much more comfortable with where the administration is.
Do either of you want to jump in here? Jennifer?
Yeah. So I'll just say two things. So on the positive side, Chris talked about how ending the Ukraine war might attenuate the cooperation. I think that that's possible, but I think stabilizing the U.S. relationship with Russia is equally important. And those two things could happen in one sort of grand bargain, but they might not. They might happen separately. So I do see a value in having a bilateral channel, and I am supportive of the administration's efforts to try to stabilize that relationship, even if it means making compromises that seem unpalatable. Like any sort of stabilization of relations with Russia and with China, which are important to attenuating the threat the U.S. perceives from this set of four countries, will require compromises that that wouldn't be necessarily ideal, but we should work to try to find something that protects U.S. interests and moves us in the direction that we'd like to. On the more negative side, I think one concern I have is that there's clearly a real urgency and a desire to have a deal. That's the goal. And my concern is that we end up with a deal that either isn't in U.S. interests, that commits it to things long-term that aren't in its interests, like new security guarantees. The U.S. already has a lot of security guarantees and can barely meet the commitments it has, so I don't think that's in U.S. interests, or an imposed peace. Now, any peace that's signed that forces Ukraine to give up territory is not going to be desirable, That needs to be an agreement that at least Ukraine can sign on to and say, yes, like we believe this will last, this will support our security. It can't be something that feels like a surrender, because in that case, Ukraine has no incentive to stick to the deal. They will have every incentive to undermine it, and they have the capabilities to do it. They have their own defense industry. They're capable of sending long-range drones and other types of things that could blow the deal up. And then I worry that the U.S. is kind of on the hook. Like, we forced the bad deal. There's a feeling of accountability, and we get dragged into like even a longer conflict. So I think that while I'm supportive of the effort to stabilize relations with Russia, the imposed deal is sort of the worst possible outcome. It would be better for the U.S. to just walk away and let Ukraine, continue to fight till it's ready to settle, or have Europe take the lead, and then to impose a deal for the sake of a deal.
I think we have one final question. We're going to take it from Zoom.
We'll take the next question from Andrew Michta.
Yeah, hi, great panel. Thank you so much. Andrew here from the Atlantic Council. I'd like to move maybe to Chris and the rest of the panel, move us from the static assessment of where the balance is in Europe to what it's likely to look like once the force posture review is completed. And what I'm anticipating is reductions in US deployments in Europe. What does it mean for Putin? What does it mean for the Chinese determination to support him? And what does it mean for the future of the European balance of power? Thank you. Over.
You want to take that first, Chris?
Well, I'm not sure exactly which force posture changes you are referring to. I mean, my understanding is that there are different ones that are under discussion. I mean, the most obvious one would be to return to the posture that we had back in 2021, or maybe even a more aggressive version, return to the posture that we had pre-2014. My own estimation is that in the near term, this doesn't actually pose a major risk to Europe. I think our European allies are, probably more capable than they realize in filling in that kind of a gap. You're talking about moving two BCTs, if I remember correctly, off the
VCTs are
brigade combat teams, large U.S. Army units. I think the Europeans can fill that in. Certainly, they can fill it in the amount of time that that it would take for Russia, which has suffered a great, has spent a great deal of resources on Ukraine, to reconstitute and pose a significant threat to NATO Europe. Now, if you're talking about going further than that, I think that's where things start to get a little bit iffy. Talking about withdrawing U.S. ground forces from Germany, consolidating, U.S. air forces in the U.K. Those kinds of moves would be pretty destabilizing, and I hope that that's not where we're headed.
Jennifer, you want to weigh in?
I mostly agree with Chris's assessment. I would be really surprised if in 4 years the changes are more significant than going back to sort of where we were 2013, which was the low under President Obama. I could see some consolidation of forces. I don't necessarily think that would be a terrible thing. I think that there is some desire to reduce the presence from the administration, but to reduce the presence of forces along in frontline countries that are bordering Russia, the Baltics, maybe Poland. At least when you're talking about the Baltics, there aren't that many U.S. forces. So that might send a signal, but it's not that many forces. Again, I agree with Chris that those could be filled in.
Do you see this as having any impact on the issue of this loose entente or alignment among China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran?
Not really. I mean, I think that Russia would like all U.S. forces out of Europe, but I don't see that as something that's going to happen in the next 4 years. I don't necessarily see that as something that's in U.S. interests, and I think even some of the most Eurosceptic people in the administration, I think, would probably agree with that. But I don't necessarily see the presence of forces in Europe as something that's going to impact the calculations. I think Russia will continue to try to rebuild and refit its army for its own purposes, and I think China will continue to try to benefit as much as it can from this, with the goal of countering and balancing or exceeding U.S. force presence in Asia.
You would think it would further strengthen the
That would be
European
my
vote.
prediction.
We
is
would
that
hope it would
further
further
strengthen
strengthen the
European
European
Depends on the
vote.
political will in Europe,
Let's,
which has always been
let's
something
not
that.
assume facts, not an evidence. what I say. That has brought us to the end of our time. First, let me apologize to members here and joining us in Zoom that I didn't get to all of your questions. We tried very hard to do so. You're welcome, for those people who are in the room, to talk to our panelists after the session. But I just basically want to say I want to thank everybody for joining us for this first session of the Hauser Symposium. I want to note that there'll be a video and transcript of the entire symposium, including this panel, posted on CFR's website, hint at cfr.org, where you can find us. And now for people here in the room and joining us via Zoom, we're going to have a brief break. And our second session, which examines the axis of autocracies in the global south, will begin at 2:30 sharp. Please join me in thanking my panelists for next time.